I'm going to talk about Ember components today. My name is Alex Matchneer. My username is Makti or Maktai, however you want to pronounce it. As of 3-4 weeks ago, I'm the most recent Ember core team member. I'm the author of a templating language called EmberJS, which is the only templating language that isn't handlebars that you can use in Ember and actually have all your data binding stuff working. So if you like Slim, Haml, Jade, any of these things, give that a shot.
Where did the name come from?
Oh, you sound like you know the answer. Who was it? Yeah, so Gordon was the guy who came up with the name of
I take full credit for the entire framework.
Yes. Well, for what it's worth, I actually do want to thank Gordon for sort of having me out, which I guess just being excited enough to get me pumped up enough to buy a ticket and come out. But Gordon is a guy who's been writing these, I don't know, so like a year and a half ago when I didn't really know anything about JavaScript, and I was thinking I'd just dig into some framework and try to make sense of it. Gordon had all these blog posts comparing all this crazy stuff and making sense of this ecosystem of all the different stabs at JavaScript frameworks that were out there, and it just kind of blew my mind. And I just felt like he was this guy on the frontier, and he just seemed to really grasp all this stuff early on. So I don't know, 9 months ago I just reached out to the guy and figured I could pick his brain. And he's definitely one of the main reasons this emblem thing exists, because we could just talk through ideas. So anyway, Gordon, just want to say thanks for having me out and thanks for being a good dude. But yes,
thanks
Gordon.
For coming, man.
Yeah, no problem. Lots of love in the room. So yes, emblem, and as I mentioned earlier, I got this weird nickname, Mr. Router, after working on one of the more drab parts of Ember and slaving away for a bunch of stuff that came out for RC6. So without further ado, Ember component, what is it? So if you're going to render anything onto the screen in an Ember app, it is going to go through an Ember view. That's the portion of Ember that's responsible for actually rendering stuff to the screen. And an Ember component is, well, as simple as is a subclass of Ember View. And more than what Ember View tries to be, it has a focus on being reusable, composable, and ideally, if we can solve some tricky problems in not just EmberJS, but sort of the JavaScript world in general, it'll be kind of shareable and easily distributable to other people. And who here is familiar with web components, or the spec that describes web components? Okay, a few people. It's some ideas that certainly have not been fully fleshed out at all. I don't actually know off the top of my head what the current browser support is, but it's basically a stab at kind of a lot of different things combined and sort of called web components. But one is this idea of you being able to create your own DOM elements that behave differently and ideally would be as reusable, composable, and shareable as this Ember component stuff I'm talking about. So Ember component is one of these things that as the spec develops, there's probably going to be some parity between the both. I won't be surprised if Ember component diverges a little bit as it tries to find some nice patterns that perhaps might make it into this web component spec, or web components people come up with cool ideas that make it into Ember component. But that's sort of one of the ideas that's in the back of the minds of people sort of espousing Ember component. So here is just a little bit of a classic overview of what Ember View is and how it sort of works. So pretend that at the top we have this the top script here. I don't have a mouse to sort of circle it, but this is just your application template, and say you've got a little header and it's printing out the value of the dynamic mustache lookup value of foo, and then it renders this custom widget view, which has the template which is at the bottom, the one that says data template name equals custom widget. This is going to render that text. Same scope as our template, e.g. displays the same foo as above. And that value for foo would be the exact same value that would be printed out at the header at the top. And what that means, what this is trying to say is that there's this concept of views that by default sort of inherit the scope of the parent that they're injected into. In general, the data that's driving the template of the view is something that lives sort of outside of the view. And that's, this is still a pattern that is going to be used probably for a long time throughout Ember. And what it affords you is this idea, this sort of division of responsibility. A view can be kind of tucked in anywhere, and because it inherits a scope, it'll just, you won't have to specifically define these things on the view itself. And as a general overview, I believe most people here are going to be familiar with this, but so this foo value is going to be looked up. I wish I had a mouse I can circle some things. But so if you have a mustache that has the little curly brace mustache that say foo, that is going to be looked up on most likely a controller. And the view is only going to be in charge of kind of managing a DOM element, rendering it to the screen, taking click events, kind of raw DOM events, translating them into sort of business logic events that can be fired on controllers or routes or whatever. And your template is just going to be your little handlebars template that is actually going to render stuff. But a template needs a context to basically know where it's getting its data from. You know, if it has foo on the screen, where is it going to get it from? Well, most of the time in Ember, it's going to be coming from a controller. So again, this is very much designed to allow for a sort of separation of concerns. So controller doesn't have to worry about all the stuff that is specific to actually rendering a DOM element to the screen and handling these raw sort of events. And basically the controller's job is just to figure out how to present or provide all the data that a template needs to render. So this is nice, separation of concerns, but there are some limitations to this, which are pretty much a lot of the idea for the drive behind why a thing called Ember.component was made. So the problem is that the separation of concerns, which works in many places, comes at the expense of a certain degree of reusability and refactorability in Ember app. So in particular, if you've got this template in a view that renders foo, that means any time that other controllers might want to make use of this template or this view that's rendering this template, those controllers all have to expose a property called foo, and that's actually ends up being kind of a messy thing to have to deal with, and it doesn't let in a lot of cases, it makes it more difficult to reuse these views that you might have custom tailored to work a certain way in multiple places in your app. And that is a lot of the basis behind creating a thing called Ember Component. So as I mentioned before, an Ember Component is an Ember view subclass whose template context is the instance of the component itself. So whereas foo in the previous cases is going to look outside of that view object and look it up on a controller, if a component's template has foo, it's going to be looking up foo on that component itself. And what that basically means is that components are views with a very, very isolated scope. You're never going to sort of look outside of yourself, if you're a component, and grab values off of wherever you happen to be injected into. It very much forces you to be way more explicit about the data that goes into a component and the actions that get fired out of a component that you're going to listen to. So taking the example that we had before, which was to just have foo, the dynamic content of foo printing in a header, and then rendering this custom view or whatever. Now we've converted custom widget into a component. So these values of foo are actually no longer going to be the same, because this one at the bottom is always going to look up foo on this instant of a custom widget component, and that foo at the top, which is still just some normal template coming from like a application view, is going to work the same as it did before. But now there's this kind of wall that's set up between the component's template and wherever it's being rendered into. And this is very much that is very much by intent. And what it forces you to do is to, components are way isolated. This is Siberia. There's nice. We got puns. So what a component basically forces you to do if you're going to render it onto a screen is to be much more explicit. It basically forces you to define an interface for like what data it expects to be passed into it, and also if you're creating a component that needs to, respond to click events or do some other thing that fires an action that you want the rest of your app to listen to, you have to very explicitly listen to these actions versus you've rendered a component to the screen and now it's just going to grab data from wherever and emit actions in any which direction. So, for instance, what it means to pass in data explicitly is if you want to render foo in a component's template, you actually have to explicitly pass it in, or it's going to just use the default foo value that's on that component. So I have the example here that says foo equals some controller property. So that's how you get, if you're rendering some component in the index template of your kind of default route. And that controller had a property called, an index controller had a property called some controller property. That's how you would pass it in to some component and give it a value, a binding for its foo property. Furthermore, for the data, not the data coming out, but the actions that might get emitted from this component, you actually have to assign it the name of the controller or route action that is going to listen for actions emitted from the component. So in this case, we have a route action name. Sorry, we have, well, that's a horrible name. We have the name of the route action, which is called route action name, that is going to be listening for these actions that are fired by an internal action name called component action. So let's actually, oh, I got one more slide before doing the demo. So what this basically means is we sort of have this weird restriction where if you had a really custom tailored view or template or whatever before Ember components, Ember.component existed, you had to kind of design any controller that wanted to make use of it. You'd expose all the properties that that view expected. There's some ways around it, but that was very often the pattern, and not going by the pattern just kind of required you to jump through some hoops. So for instance, I had this existing example of some component foo equals some controller property. If you want to render it somewhere else, all you need to do is say, okay, the value that I'm assigning for foo for this other rendering of a component is this other thing. And now component action in this other case is now going to map to another action name on the controller or the route. So it's very easy to just render these all over the place in your app, as long as you're saying how the data gets in and how the actions are mapped to route or controller actions. And like I said before, there's no need to change controller property names or do any other logic in the sort of outside world to make it accommodate a component that you want to render into a template in various places in your app. So let's actually look at some code. There is, where is it here? Something else that I was looking at. All right. So I've got something which is based very closely on the Ember starter kit, which is just a zip that you can unzip from EmberJS.com. And where is the block here? That's stuff from another presentation. So let's say you have a very basic index HTML in app.js. This is as simple as it gets. Index HTML with loading jQuery, handlebars, Ember, and your actual app code. We've got nothing here but Ember application create. And this is what this looks like. I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit and make something a little bit decently more complex so you can actually have something more than just a basic toy to sort of understand what's going on. We're going to make a quick autocomplete component. And I got some of this pre-written code. I'll step through it shortly. You can see what's going on. So let's see here. First thing I'll do in this case is grab the template code that I need to actually render what this component looks like. And the rule with the naming conventions for templates, for component templates, is you need to give it a name of components / and then whatever the name of the component's going to be. And another requirement is that it has to have a dash. There's a few different reasons for it. One of the main reasons is just that that's the way that the web component specifications that I was talking about before work, so that you don't collide with other existing HTML elements. It's got a dash in it. It's not going to be anything that your browser has already known about for the last 10 years at least. So if you're going to be rendering it, if you're going to be naming a component, it's got to have a dash in it. It's just one of these little requirements. So what's going on here is that we're saying inside this component, which is going to be an autocomplete component, there is an input, there's a little text field, whose value is bound to search text. And because we are in the world of components, there's no kind of scope leaking. So search text is going to be a value that is looked up on this autocomplete component, and it's not going to get this search text value from anywhere that it's rendered into, because you're completely isolated. The only data that comes in is what you explicitly assign when you're rendering this component. And we are going to have a list of results as you're typing stuff in. If whatever you're typing in matches some dictionary values, all those should ideally be printed in here. And right now, if I just save this and refresh, it's not going to print anything because all I've done is define what this components template looks like. I haven't actually injected it anywhere in this main template. So all I'm going to do here is say, like this guy here's name is autocomplete. Save it. And so at the very least, I have a completely non-working, nothing happening text field and no results list because, well, all I have is this sort of default materialized component instance and certainly nothing defined in it called results or search text.
And this is happening, you can output that because you don't need to have a template anymore. Is that right? So the reason why you're able to render that on the screen is because, and you don't have a template?
Oh, this is separate from what I was talking about before. This is actually the way that it's always, the requirement is that, starting at least from Ember 1.0, is that you always had to have some template called components / whatever.
Okay, that is a template, sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
You're right.
So what I'm demonstrating here is that you can actually render a component to the screen and have it just materialize a default, completely unmodified Ember component instance for you. It's just, obviously, if you're using something so default, you're not going to be able to specify what results means or what search text is. Oh, well, for what it's worth, you could, is this going to work? Yeah, blah, blah, blah.
Is the actual component defined, like the JavaScript is defined somewhere, or is it not?
Not yet. So this is our app.js file. It's still empty.
So
all that's happening here.
The most minimalist component can be just the handlebars.
Just the template that has the expected name that it's looking for. Oh, so let me just how good is the audio? Do I need to follow the rule of repeating every question that comes out? Maybe, maybe not. I'll be a little more lazy this time around, I think.
So you could pass in an array of results into this and it would actually...
Sure, let's do that. I mean, honestly, so I've heard that there are requests for more code in some of these meetups, so I'm happy to go mildly tangential on some of this stuff. So if there's something here that, if it mostly makes sense, but you want to try this sort of similar way of getting something to show up on the screen or trying some other weird aspect of components, just shout it out. I'm happy to experiment with certain things if it's going to help make sense of things. So could you also, so the question was, could you also pass in results equals something and have that work and have that just render everything, every element of that array? Sure, you could do that. I'm trying to think, what's the, this would be weird. It possibly won't work. Wasn't planning on doing this. Will this work? No? No, let's not.
Okay, let's not do that.
Oh, well, I have to do this, actually. I'm not going to try to make that work. I'm not really sure what the status is of this weird hacky referring to globals.
What's the expected behavior around that? Like, if it's unquoted, it's a...
Good question. So basically, as you can see here, so basically one of the things that I did here was I said autocomplete, and then I added this, search text equals blah, blah, blah. And what that's saying is that, okay, I'm going to give a value for search text, which is going to be referenced here, which is why I was able to get blah, blah, blah to show up instead of the default nothing here. So what that demonstrated among how you pass, in addition to how you could actually pass some data into it, was that because this is quoted, it's treated as a raw string. Let's actually...
An expression, or is it, can you do 2 + 2?
No, you can't do 2 + 2. That was from the Angular side of the field, wasn't it?
Well, I'm just curious about terminology, kind of like when you talk about search text and it equals a string.
Handlebars is going to try to shy away from like evaluating expressions because it's very much trying to be like as logicless as possible.
Okay.
It's very much the intent of Handlebars to be as dumb as possible so that all the things that go into the data that drives the template is handled somewhere else. That's sort of the power of what computed property is on a controller, so all this complex stuff doesn't end up dirtying templates, but it's...
Well, in a component, you put it in the component.
Right. It's, so whoever happens to be the context of the template, whether you're using views in its controller or you're using a component and it's coming from the component itself, the goal is for you to put all that stuff not in the template, but in whatever is driving the template with data.
What
So-
about when you say like value equals search text? Do you say, is that a key value or is that value?
So this is saying,
I mean, like, just the abstract term for the left side message equals sign.
so what this is happening here, I don't know if it's going to make sense to put it in quite those terms. I mean, this is like kind of key value.
Like in a normal HTML tag, you say attribute and then you say the value of the attribute.
Yeah, so it's just that the right-hand side could either be this quoted kind of static value, or if you omit your quotes, it's going to be a binding.
Okay.
So because there's no quotes here, it's just like a path to a property. It's going to say value is within this little text field is going to be bound to this search text property.
It might be helpful to put a variable in the route called foo or something and say search text equals foo.
So then the search text, oh, sorry, I mean,
Oh, no.
before you leave the screen, so when you do search text equals blah, 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 then you're passing in a property and then you're setting the property the value to blah, blah, blah.
Say it one more time. I'm so sorry.
Oh, sorry. Like, so value equals search text on the bottom, and then when you pass it in, you're saying, I want to pass in this property with the value equal to blah, blah, blah.
Right, so when this says value equals search text, it's saying, okay, I'm going to look for a property called search text. And right now, because no autocomplete component has been defined to say what search text property is, the only other possible place that it could look for a value is what you explicitly pass in. So because I say, okay, when rendering autocomplete, I'm going to set its value search text to the string blah, 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 that is what makes it possible for this to find this value blah, 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 blah.
Okay.
Blah, blah, blah.
Literally.
It might be helpful too to sort of do that twice to show that there's two components with two completely different concepts.
Oh, I promise I will get to that.
Okay.
Let's actually not, for now, I'll come back to how it takes to get data from like a controller route into it. For now, let's actually create this autocomplete component. Again, I got some of this code pre-written. I can scale it down if it's too much and it doesn't make a lot of sense, but I don't think it's too cray-cray. And okay, so what I'm doing here, I'm saying rather than just materializing this default Ember component and backing this with this sort of default component, I'm going to define what the autocomplete component class. So when I actually render this to the screen, it's going to create an instance of this, and that is what is going to drive this thing with data. That is what is going to kind of respond to actions that might be fired from this. So I'm saying search text is null or empty. Again, this gets overridden by whatever you pass into it. I'm going to say, here's a starter dictionary. This, for what it's worth, does not make a whole lot of sense as far as there's not going to be a whole lot of times when you're just going to provide this sort of static array in a component. I mean, yeah, there are some use cases, but this is just to get something to show up, and then I'll show you a more common approach to this, to how to actually set the data that's coming in. So now remember, I had the template of the components iterating over a thing called results, and for every result, it's going to print this li element to the screen. Now I'm actually saying what results is. Results is a computed property that updates every time search text changes. It is going to grab the value of search text. If it's empty, just return this empty array. We don't want, empty, a completely blank search text to just return all the elements in the dictionary. So if it's not there, return nothing. We're going to create a regex based on the search text that is case insensitive. And we are going to take this array, dictionary, and we're going to filter it and basically return from this function an array of only the words in this dictionary that match this regex. So kind of decently basic computer property stuff from Ember. And just by adding this in here, because I have a default dictionary, as I type in stuff, then any of these names that match this regex that I'm creating are going to show up in this results list. Before moving on, I don't really know the level of everyone here. Is there any questions about how this is working, why it works, and anything about what I've written that might not make a lot of any sense? Happy to stop and go into some things more. Decently okay? Okay.
It's very elegant in its succinctness.
That's nice. Yeah, I like looking at this code too. It's cool. So dictionary is still this kind of static array, not very useful. In an Ember app, usually the way things work is that when you navigate into a route, it's up to the route to say, okay, this is going to be the data that is driving all the stuff that gets displayed in this template versus, let's just render a bunch of components that already know the data they're going to display. So what would be a good exercise is let's replace this dictionary with something that the route will specify. Just do some more sort of idiomatic Ember stuff. I could copy what I already have. It's short. I'll accept into the part that actually does the JSON query. But if what I want to do, so right now this is coming from the application template. So I can put the data that is going to be driving this is whatever I expose to the application controller, and the thing that decides what goes in there when you navigate into the top level application route is, well, application route. So I'm going to say application route is an Ember route that overrides the defaults by saying what data is going to get loaded. So what I'm going to do is have a different set of names, whatever, Ember, Angular, backbone. And what this is going to do sort of behind the scenes, according to typical idiomatic Ember patterns, is this is going to set the application controller's model to this array. And if I want to pass in this, so what this means is that, I'll say it again, the application controller that gets generated that's going to drive this template is going to have a model property that is equal to this array that I returned from here. So if I want to take this array and have this be the dictionary of the autocomplete, what do I need to do with this here line? Somebody volunteer.
Define dictionary. Dictionary equals model.
Dictionary equals model. Is there going to be quotes? No quotes, because I'm not passing the string model, I'm basically creating a data binding, I'm passing an array. So let's see if this works. I've got a simple array, Ember, Angular, backbone, and ideally I'm going to override this hardwired one that I put into component. Great, so I type in E. Now the dictionary that's going to be using to look up all this stuff is going to be coming from the outside world. This is sort of what I meant when I said that everything in the component is very isolated. The only stuff that's going to get in is what you very explicitly set here. So I'm very explicitly saying your dictionary is model, which in typical Ember fashion is coming from the controller, and that got into the controller because that's what the application route said it was going to put in there.
Each time you enter a new text, is it going to load the dictionary, or is it just loading one time?
So the array is just put into the component at one time, and the only thing that's happening each time you update the text is to kind of filter this array based on this new regex that's been created based on the search text. But it's not like passing in the array each time.
That it's actually assigned. And then it's,
sorry, I missed the first part. What did you say?
It's only assigned once, or
correct. Yeah. At render time, that array is now kind of in the component, made known to the component. The only thing, again, that happens multiple times is just filtering that same array. So for what it's worth, this isn't specific to components, but because it's cool, we can do something like this. And instead of just returning a static array from this model hook, we can return an actual JSON query. So I'm returning all of the contributors. I'll just make this small for a second. In EmberJS. And I don't want to go too much into promises, but what this is doing is saying when this data comes back, take this list of contributors and then return an array, because it's basically it's going to come back as an array of objects with a bunch of different properties on it. But one of those properties is login, which is the username. So what's going to happen here, if everything works and I haven't somehow lost the Wi-Fi connection, is I'm going to refresh this. It's going to take a second. And now when I type in this stuff, get this massive list of things that gets filtered down as I type in more stuff. And as I said, it's very easy to render multiple components. Let's say I want to have one component which is getting its dictionary driven by what is set by the application route, and one that is just using default one that I defined in the dictionary itself. I'm sorry, in the component itself. Oops. So it's easy enough. I don't have to do anything really special to get two of these things to show up. And yeah, I mean, this is I mean, strictly what I've written on the screen is stuff that you could have done with Ember views, but again, a lot of the major win is, well, it's much easier to render these in multiple places, and basically when you need to say, okay, I'm going to take this autocomplete component and put it in this route and move it here and shift this thing around, it's because it's such a well-contained thing that has very limited responsibility. It knows about a dictionary and it knows about a search query. You don't need to kind of reorganize all the stuff that the outside world needs to set up in order for a component to properly render itself. So it's great for instance, all of this input field, there's an input helper that I'm using here, which is just kind of given to you by Ember. It's just a stock helper, but this is actually a component. So a lot of the stuff that's really self-contained has just one job and doesn't necessitate splitting a view, that thing that handles the mostly DOM element stuff, and severing it from its sort of source of data, having a controller. When stuff is really self-contained, just throw it into a component. If you want to use things in multiple places and you can think of a nice sort of explicit API for how data comes in, then you use a component. That's what it sort of makes sense for.
Is there a concept of subcomponents? So if a component is within another component and you want to, say, substitute that, can you do that? Or no?
Substitute that.
For example, let's say you have a list of these auto search input, and one of them you want it to act a certain way, and another one to act another way. I'm just curious as to the way to, because you can think of different elements that are not going to be just as
Sure.
simple, they're going to be complex.
So I mean, we can go places with this concept, and for what it's worth. What I'm about to show doesn't really make sense for autocomplete. I don't really know.
Sure. What about a calculator with number of buttons and operator buttons?
So that could be a calculator component, and it could have calculator button components inside of it.
Yeah.
Again, one of the major goals of components is to be composable. It's kind of built to the root of the word, and so that's definitely that's the goal of a lot of this stuff. You should be able to have these self-contained things, if in fact it makes sense for them to be self-contained, and assemble these much larger things, and build giant components out of smaller ones. That's definitely one of the goals. Well, one of the things that you mentioned, which is worth going over, and I didn't actually plan too much about talking about it, is what's sort of another way that you can override some of these defaults, or specify things specific to a specific rendering of a component. And one nice thing about components is that you can invoke them in block form. So before I just had it looking like this. And now what I'm going to do is basically pass in some custom template stuff. And if I just refresh, this isn't actually going to show up anywhere because I haven't taken this thing that I'm passing in and yielded it to the screen anywhere. Again, this doesn't make sense for autocomplete components, but just bear with me. If I want to take this block of code that I passed in and actually render it to the screen, all I need to do is provide this yield helper, which is pretty nice. So I don't know, you can imagine a name tag component that says hello, my name is, and that's sort of what's in the default template for a component. And then in the my name is, that's where you put a yield, and that allows you to pretty easily put in whatever you want in that sort of gap. So that should, this whole calling it yield is sort of a bit of a Rails hangover if you've done sort of Rails layouts, and then whatever goes in that yield is what's specific to that controller action and rendering, but that should seem somewhat familiar. You had a question?
Yeah, I wasn't paying attention earlier. The dictionary, is that something stock that you can pass in, or can you pass in any number of parameters to the component?
You can pass in any number of parameters. It's not going to yell at you, but if I just say ASD equals hello, this does nothing to the behavior or the display of this component, because nowhere in here do I display ASD, or nowhere in here do I use it in various calculations of a computed property. But if I did for some reason want to append whatever the value of ASD was.
Okay, I saw your other code. So I wasn't aware. So dictionary, you just named a dictionary in your component because you wanted to, not because it's any kind of convention.
Yeah, exactly. So that when I say when you're writing a component, you're essentially defining an interface for how data comes in. That interface is whatever, because I say that in here I'm going to make use of a thing called a dictionary in order to figure out what this list of results is. Dictionary is now part of that interface. If I want to override it and say the dictionary is now this random array, or what I did here, which is it is the array of contributors to EmberJS, that's how you override it. So whatever data your component uses is kind of part of that overrideable interface to the outside world. Yeah.
Kind of related to that last example, can you talk briefly about what, I don't know if it's the right term, initialization or instantiation of the component means? Like, for example, if dictionary exists, obviously if you don't define it in the template or don't output it or yield it, it's not going to do anything or show up anywhere. But like you have search text equals null. Is that sort of the best recommended pattern, or can you leave it under define? Does that make sense what I'm asking? Kind of what is the state, the initial state of any property or action or function?
So if it's eventually going to be the value of like some primitive, search text is either going to be like an empty string or a string, or if you haven't actually set its value, it might just be null. For a primitive, it doesn't really matter. There is that one kind of gotcha that can happen, just not specific to Ember, but just JavaScript in general. If you were, I don't know if I want to write all the code to demonstrate why this can happen, but if, for instance, you had some array and you gave it a starting value, and every one of these components was displaying some array, and if you just left it like this, kind of defined in the sort of prototype of this component, and somewhere else in your component you said, okay, take some array and then push 6 to it or 7 to it, then you would notice the kind of weird thing, which is that every component that was rendering this and had overridden some array would also have the values 6, 7, and wherever you push to it display at the same time, because you're not using a primitive, you're using this array in the way that this sort of...
There's a global,
right, it's shared.
Instance of that. Okay.
And the way that you could actually give each component its own array to not like pollute all the other components that might be displayed is you can use a init, you can do it that way. I kind of prefer to use the other more recent pattern since 1.0 of my favorite pattern for doing something like that is to have a reset function, which at any point you can call and kind of set these values again. Some array. Say I just want it to be a default or blank array, and then you can say on init. So this is a little bit nicer than saying, putting this in the init function and having to remember to call super and all this other crap. And you can also just at any point say reset, and I'll leave you that. Sorry, this is a little bit tangential, but you guys have questions, so I'm happy to answer them. So I do know what I want to move on to next, which is, I mentioned how you define your interface for how data gets in. So what's the opposite, which is how data gets out, and that's firing actions. But question?
Maybe you want to push it to later, but at the beginning you introduced these as reusable, composable, and then you said with luck or something, shareable.
Yeah, and easily distributable.
Yeah, and it looks like they're very self-contained. So I was just curious what the stumbling block is to make them shareable.
The stumbling block is that just in the JavaScript world, there's just this concept of how do I put things into a module and then have this module depend on this module, and maybe depend on a specific version of this module before it gets incompatible with this particular version, and having that all settle and just saying like, okay, I'm in this Ember app and I want this module and I want it to all be just magically resolved. No one's really come up with the right sort of packaging behind that, and it's a very complex problem, and there's nothing out there that's super great. It isn't totally crazy I mean, I think one thing that could possibly work if you just want to have, you know, on some public website or some S3 site, autocomplete component.js, it would need to have all this code, but, you know, are you going to pollute the global namespace and set it to a thing called app, or are you just going to say, now, whatever, whenever you include the script, it's going to be this global autocomplete component that you need to then, once it's loaded into your page, like set on your apps namespace. It's just all this complicated stuff that usually comes into these questions of how do you avoid this weird kind of global pollution stuff. Furthermore, there's the problem of, you know, how do you get this template to be in this single bundled JavaScript file of this component that you want? And, you know, feasibly, you could have some build tool that pre-compiles it and then sets the template property. I mean, there's ideas and there's a sort of direction to them, but no one's really like totally figured it out yet. And this isn't specific to Ember again. This is just people trying to solve this problem and do it right for all the different JavaScript frameworks and applications that really want this kind of feature. So that's sort of the stumbling block with making these things easily distributable and shareable.
Does the Ember core team have any plans of sort of Ember vetted or Ember backed components that are kind of have their stamp on it that they're going to, you know, get built or add, or any thoughts on just?
So Chris is going to follow up and talk a little bit more about some specific applications, and I think that would make sense to let him talk a little bit more about. I have a few more things I want to do, which is basically one last thing before moving on to the slides and letting Chris talk is, so how do you get actions to fire out of the component and actually be something that you can listen to in the outside world? So looking back at this template I have for the autocomplete component, I have each of these things as links, and you click them and nothing happens right now. And the reason for that is I'm saying fire this event called result selected, and I'm going to get rid of this yield and make this a little bit simpler. Fire result selected, and right now I'm not actually doing anything with result selected. So how do I take this thing which is internally firing as an action called result selected and having it fire out to the outside world? Because remember, you've got to be explicit about everything that's going to get in or out of the component. Well, true to form of anything that is going to respond to this action helper, the first thing I need to do is take this guy, result selected, put in this actions hash, have a handler, prove that it works, just for my own sake. It works, and also just say what word is actually being sent back. And okay, that works, great. So what I want to do is take this result selected action and fire it to the outside world so that, for instance, this application route can respond to it. So in here, I'm going to say, okay, here are all the actions that application route knows how to respond to, and I can have something named word was selected. And ideally, the goal here is to take this thing which is fired in this isolated land of the autocomplete component and get it to be in application route. Once it's in here, then you can use all of your pre-existing Ember knowledge to do all the crazy business logic stuff that you already know how to do with it. But the goal here is to get this out of the isolated world into the outside world. And the way you do that, just in the same way that your interface data into it is to explicitly set it, and when you're rendering it, the way that you get it out is to use a method available to components called sendAction. And if you just do this, let's give it a name. There is a default where you can just say sendAction, but I want to actually pass data along with it, so I'm just going to be more explicit about it. I'm going to send an action called word was, I don't know, chosen. And then I'm going to forget it again. Chris, correct me if I'm doing this wrong. But second parameter is just the context that I'm shooting out? Okay. So I'm saying send action, and the final thing that's missing is to establish a mapping between what is internally known as word was chosen and what I'm going to listen on the application route as a word was selected. And the way to make this work is to say, let me get rid of the second one, is to say word was chosen, and provide a string of the action that it kind of translates into, which is word was selected. So again, I'm establishing a mapping from internal send actions to what the outside world knows and can respond to, which is an action called word was selected. And just to demonstrate that it's actually working, I'm going to say I am application route and word is word. So ideally, when I say this, I'm application route and the word is ycats. Now this might seem like a little bit of, bit of a hassle to kind of go through all this work to take something that's inside a component and have it fired to the outside world. But again, to sort of demonstrate why this is cool is that you've got this self-contained autocomplete component, which you can render multiple times, and you can have your first one. You can have them both driven by the same list of GitHub contributors, but one refers to one piece of business logic, and the other one refers to other word was selected. And now you've got two separate components that are all firing different application route actions. And
Does a component action, is a component action required to have hyphens in it as well, or is that just?
No, that's convention. So
Oh,
the only thing
convention?
that's,
Okay.
yeah, it's just convention, like
To
so
keep
this
the
sort of,
namespace is separate, just make it obvious that it's a different namespace again.
yeah, I mean, you could have camel case word was chosen. It's just to sort of make these things kind of look like web components and custom HTML elements. It's just sort of become a convention to have all your keys where possible.
So
But that's not true. I don't even think the opinion's really set on that. Just I kind of like the way it looks. I've seen enough people do it, but it's not a requirement for it to actually work.
I guess the next question would be, is there any interest in making it try to find, if you name an action inside a component, just by default have it look
Yeah.
for that action outside?
So the convention there, if you just want to fire an action and not send any additional data, like for instance, we're sending the word that was actually selected. We're not just saying something happened and then the outside world needs to make sense of it. We're passing data. I don't think there is a way to call send action and just send a piece of data but not the name. But what I was sort of referring to before is if you just say this, that send action, like this, that's going to fire an action to the outside world that is called action. And then all you need to do is say,
Oh, so you just had a default action.
yeah. And this means that if you have an application route action called SDNSD, that is going to respond to the sort of default action that gets fired from here.
So there's no data.
But there's no data. So if you need to send data, I believe the way it works now is that you need to be explicit about the name of the action as well.
What happens to the action if it's not defined in the outer scope? Is it just done?
You'll probably, if it's, so at which point is it not defined?
Well, so you said action there. And said, hey,
Like a typo.
yeah, typo.
At which point?
Go back to the template. So if you said action equals food, but food didn't exist.
Word was chosen equals
Word was selected food, that.
certain foo. What this is going to do is this is going to fire an action on your routes, expecting to have some route or controller respond to that, but it's not going to find one because we haven't specified one, and it's going to yell at us. Oops. I'll just try it first, and then I'll show you what it shows up. Click ycats, nothing happened because nothing handled the event foo, which, as far as Ember errors goes, that's a pretty clear as day one, which is nice. We get more tourists sometimes, admittedly.
But the opposite, if you don't define, if you remove word was chosen equals food, that whole bit, and don't even define it.
Then you're fine. Yeah, it's not like you need to, it's just there's not gonna be an error, it won't be like this kind of thing. I'll just show you. Just part of the sort of intended flexibility is that you don't need to specify every bit of this sort of API or interface you're defining in order to render this thing to the screen, or else that would be a major drag. So as much as we're still firing actions and handling them internally, no one's listening to the send action here, and Ember doesn't complain. It's not treated as an error. It's just that's one thing that's coming out of the component that you've opted out of listening on. So that is as much as I want to do for a demo, because this is definitely...
How do you handle a Boolean field coming out of the component?
a Boolean field.
So I was working on a checkbox, and I wanted it to do like an apple slider, and first of all, I was having a hard time trying to put the label around the outside. To be able to click on the label to change a checkbox, you need to have the name of the ID, and I was having a hard time using the ID of the view in both places. I can show you that code, but
I don't know off the top of my head. I would probably want to look at that.
Okay. I'll
I'll
show you
together.
But you can just pass out.
For something like that, if you wanted to pass in, so for instance, if you had a checkbox component or a special one that kind of decorated the default one that's given to you in some way, the sort of approach you take there, you wouldn't have that be like an action that fires every time it gets toggled true or false. So a better way to handle something like that is to explicitly pass in the value, like the binding of when your checkbox is checked. And so that means if you're passing in from the outside world, in the outside world you change it to true, magically the checkbox becomes checked. And if you change it to false, it becomes unchecked. And if you click on the checkbox, that changes it in the outside world, and vice versa.
Sure.
That'd be the sort of way to do it, not actions. I'd have to see your specific case to see what's not actually working.
It seems like it's great that, like this component is, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. Is there a library of these components that...
I hope there will be one. There's actually, believe it or not, more to this presentation where I go tangential and talk about things that I want to see that would
go for it.
Add to, ideally make a sort of palatable component ecosystem. And I really should probably move on to that. So I'll take more questions at the end. But that's the long and short of these things as far as how we usually see some of the real code.
Someone's building the Bootstrap library as a bunch of Ember components.
Really?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
there was already an Ember Bootstrap. Is this a separate endeavor?
This is built as components now.
Okay. I'd be curious to see it. I think it's going to be a better approach than the previous way where everything was a view and you still handle all these challenging problems of stuff not being self-contained.
It's in Bower, so
Okay. Yeah, I'd be curious to check it out. I'm not sure how well it's done. There's a lot of these things that seem sort of promising, sort of seem to adhere to the kind of Ember buzzwords and don't pan out as well, but that I haven't heard that one, so it could be different and special.
They're all their own namespace, but it's pretty slick. I mean, it's just, you include it, call it, and you got whatever.
Yeah, no, I'll definitely check it out. I just have no idea about it's common. So, someone asked about shareability, and based on what I was saying when I said that there isn't really the perfect solution to this yet. There's problems, which is you've got your component code. Are you going to install it globally, or are you going to adhere to some AMD module syntax? And then you also have your template, which needs to get prepackaged, which implies that you might have some build tools, and your CSS that you want to have to decorate your component in some way. You could technically, have a little style tag that gets printed out for every component that you have. The problem, you don't want to do that because that just kind of sucks. So maybe you want to have some extra code that says, okay, none of these components have been rendered, so don't display any of its CSS. And then the first time it renders, that'll just magically put some CSS to the top of the page. I mean, I don't really know the answer to this stuff yet, but that's some of the messiness that comes into making this work right. And this sort of modularly kind of stuff, this is not like what my brain's even good at processing. So someone could say what I just said, ideally more eloquently, but I don't think anyone's really solved this all that well. Okay, so this is kind of going into the zone where I don't think anyone on Ember Core, other than me, is certain that this is a good idea. So if you are inspired by this and you want to start tweeting about it, and suddenly everyone else wonders like where the hell they got these ideas, let me just say that I don't even know if they're good yet, but I think these are, this is stuff that I find pretty exciting, and I think there's some promise to this that would ideally kind of contribute to an ecosystem of reusable, composable components that doesn't sort of suffer from a lot of the issues that jQuery plugins have, which is that everyone's going to want to have their own little custom thing they want to do with, I don't know, a carousel, and that's why you end up with a carousel which has like 150 different options in your jQuery plugin, and it's, you know, when all you really want to do is like, damn it, I just don't want this like title bar, everything's cool, I want to take this thing and move it, not everything can be like stylized. So if you can, there is some risk that, you know, even with all this like fluffy talk about composability and shareability and blah, 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 that it's going to, there's still like that chance that it's going to get as bad as the jQuery plugin. But I do have some ideas, if you want to hear them, of what could be a little bit better that kind of leverages stuff specific to components that should ideally avoid this sort of jQuery plugin free-for-all. And for what it's worth, someone whose brain is way more adept at talking about this sort of thing would be Trek from the core team. And there is a presentation that he did at Ember Camp, which I think was back in January or so, of his goal of seeing this ideal sort of composable world coming together. So definitely check that out as a supplement, or even consider this a supplement to that. But anyway, here's sort of one different way you can think about how these things can come together. So say that you've already solved the problem of importing this Ember calendar into your page. You've solved the problem with how it's going to be, what module format it's going to be, or whether it's going to be global and blah, blah, blah. You figured out all the CSS. Now you're in some template and you actually want to render it, and you'll say Ember calendar. Great. You've like printed out this thing, and this should seem familiar if anyone's ever done the jQuery UI calendar. Very sorry for anyone watching this who stylized this thing before. I'm totally ripping this off. So this is going to, the next slide is going to be a little bit strange as far as existing sort of standards go for overriding stuff, but hopefully you'll see sort of what I'm getting at. So, oh wow, totally missing. I think I accidentally deleted a slide. So, two things happening here. Say your designer says, okay, I don't want there to be any year displayed in that month bar. And I also want there to be a ridiculous amount of exclamation points, both in the month header, which now no longer has a year as it did here, and I also want there to be an exclamation point after every one of these days. Well, it turns out that the component author who created this Ember calendar has sort of defined these overridable blocks for you that you at any point can just open and pass in as your sort of template block a way to, for each of these blocks that are sort of already predefined, pre-used, you can override their content. So, for instance, you can override the month header block and say, all I want is a month, forget the year, and I want a bunch of exclamation points. Done. I want to take the day cell and still print out the day that it knows about, add a little exclamation point. Done. The component, I have some special app-specific need for what I'm putting together where I need the month header to, I don't know, click and do some crazy thing. So how do I do that? Again, I don't know if anyone wants to even see a helper called super. I feel like whatever the living equivalent of turning over in your grave is, I feel like Chris Selden's probably doing this right now. So for instance, this is again in my head for how I want to see this possibly working. You're going to take this existing month header and you are going to wrap it in a tag that emits an action when you click on it. There are other ways you can possibly do this, but this is basically the goal. And the reason I'm talking about all this stuff is that it's nice when you are thinking about an ecosystem of composable components and blah, blah, blah. It's nice for there to be some defaults that you can work with. But at any point, if you really just want to start over and say, okay, it's great that I can override this month header, it's great that I can override this day cell, but really my needs are so crazy that all I really need is, I don't know, this little piece of, this list of days or so on and so forth. Then you can just reuse all the internals of the Ember calendar and rewrite it from scratch using whichever of these little internal blocks that you want. And I thought I had an example of it, I don't, but this is kind of what gets me excited about some of this work. And yeah, is it cray-cray? It's probably a little cray-cray. Again, no one really agrees with me, but yeah, I don't even think that many people know about the ideas. But again, it's all about how do you, if we're going to try to, if we talk a lot about this sort of buzzword of composability and shareability can actually be done. Well, not if every time someone releases a new component, you've got to dig through just 150 options looking for the one that you actually care about, when you can really just like take a look at this template that's been created for you and be like, oh, right, that's the block that I don't care about. Redefine that, get rid of this thing, wrap this thing in something that I can listen to an action on, versus trying to find the weird, strictly JavaScript way of doing it. So a lot of this could be totally wrong, but in some form, I'm pretty sure these ideas are going to come out, and it's a lot of what I'm excited to work on. I have one sort of last thing to show, which is all this code with kind of providing the name of the block that you want to override and then having it magically update in the one that you actually render to the screen. That particular stuff isn't coded and working yet. What I do have is a decent sketch of, where is it here? Right, of sort of where things are at with this. So this is very Railsy. What I ended up doing, oops, I don't even really want to show you the implementation of how it works because I think the rest of Ember Core would get mad at me if I did. Say I have a component. So this is very similar to what I was talking about before. Here I have this, this is sort of what the author of a component would say. It's like, okay, I've got a block called shared thing, and this is the default value of that block that just says shared thing. And then there's a scumbag block that says I'm a default scumbag. Then I yield all the stuff that whoever's using my component and providing the block into can, this is where they provide all their overrides. So let me just get rid of this here. So here I am rendering this component. Fun with components is just the non-component component header tag that I have here, but this is the actual rendering of it. I'm not overriding anything in any way. In fact, I could just write this as, in non-block form. You get the same thing in the same way that you could do in Ember calendar. But say I want to override content for shared thing. So this should seem familiar, just in a slightly different syntax of what was in the slides. But so now I still have this default scumbag, but I've decided to override the block that gets passed into here. And say I want to do the same thing, or say that I want to, I don't know, render some other component. The input tag is a component, as I mentioned before. So say I want to take this scumbag thing that I wrote and override some of the text, but also reuse or put some other components into it. Imagine input is some other thing that I've downloaded and included in this app in some way.
For content for.
Where is that?
Before content for.
Thank you. So now I've replaced scumbag with a bunch of other components, and just pretend for a moment that input came from, some other library that I downloaded. So I don't know what of these patterns are going to make it into this final ecosystem of composable, shareable, reusable components. But I hope to see something like this. I think it's something that could sustain that and get people involved in creating this thing. And ideally, you don't have multiple people taking a stab at a calendar component that has a million options just to override this stuff, which can be very easily expressed in a sort of template form and adhering to normal components, that normal component paradigm. Did you have a question?
Yeah, actually. So in terms of scope, so this is something I kind of saw earlier when you were doing the yielded stuff, but those input boxes that you had inside the scumbag content block.
I love just by using these terms, I make everyone ask ridiculous questions.
So where would if you were to put a value in one of those input boxes, where would it pull that binding from? Would it pull it from the actual component, or would it pull it from the controller where this?
I'll answer that question, but not in the realm of the crazy shit that I'm talking about here. Because that's a good question. It's just in the realm of like all the stuff that I've done that no one really agrees on yet. Mm-hmm. I don't want to answer that because it's just going to be garbage in, garbage out. I don't know what is going on with, oh, okay, it's finally settled. But the basic question, and I actually screwed up on this a week ago when I had to talk about components in Boston. But for instance, if you have a custom component, and the name that you give it is something. Sorry, I have to just do it a little bit more to set up the basics of this. And
do you want the template to be a component?
Yes. Oh, I do. Right. So I got to remember to do this. Component slash something. So all this is going to have is some value, and we're going to force whoever's going to render this component to pass this thing in. And I'll put some exclamation points so you can at least see this thing being rendered. Say something. And I'm not actually providing any value, but if I want to pass in the model,
what is something or some value? Is it undefined or null?
I mean, for the purpose of displaying in a template, it's because it's undefined or null or one of these blanky sort of values, it just is nothing. But right now, I believe it's going to try to look it up, and because I haven't specified anywhere, it's just going to be undefined. But if I want to say, what was I trying to say here? No, I don't want it to be some value. I want this to be yield, because the question was, what scope is the stuff that gets yielded? So if I just do something static, like I get that. If I want to actually pass in something from the route, which is going to answer your question, if I said model, no, sorry, what I want to do is take the name off of this model here. So I'm going to say name. And so that should answer your question here. Where does name come from? Well, it turns out it's kind of like a Ruby block, where whatever goes in this block is going to have the scope of what's outside of here. So that's sort of a convenience as to how you can take values from the outside world and put it in this yielded template block. Now, again, the reason I didn't want to answer this in the context of all the other crazy shit I was talking about is that a lot of the crazy stuff I'm talking about might possibly require overriding some of those defaults for the sake of composability and shareability and overriding these defaults. It might so happen that in these weird components, they alter what scope means. They alter what helpers and stuff that you can invoke while inside this block. Okay. Like, keep on referring you guys to the discourse. Oh, that's not the right one. To sort of go back to this, oh well, the original one, the original sort of metaphor that I made was a component called toolshed, and then inside this toolshed were a bunch of helpers that you could only invoke only while inside of a toolshed. So if you said, this thing said toolshed said Makai, and then you said screwdriver or whatever, this would be something like, this would kind of break the rules where screwdriver's not coming out of the scope like that thing that I just showed you. Screwdriver is a helper or a component, subcomponent or whatever that exists only within the scope of this block here. Again, this is not real stuff yet, but for the purpose of this ecosystem, which I envision, it'd be probably going to be required to sort of bend these defaults in a way that makes this stuff easy to override. I've been talking for a very long time. I should probably wrap this up. I'll take some just quick questions on this before letting Chris follow up. Any questions before me and Chris comes up? Okay, that is it for me. Again, my name is Alex, M-A-C-H-T-Y on Twitter and GitHub. Thank you very much.